Thank you, Donald, and a Happy New Year to everybody. How are your resolutions holding up? So far, I've kept to mine. More about that in a moment. But who can possibly have missed the dramatic events we've seen over the course of the last week in Iran? Demonstrations. Why? Well, high inflation, high unemployment, things economically very bad inside Iran. But of course, remember, this is a very unpleasant, nasty, repressive regime. And I couldn't believe it, that some of those protesters, and by the way, over 20 have been killed, and at least 500 are in prison, but some of those protesters were actually calling for the return of the Shah. Now, unless you're over 50, you won't remember this, but back in 1979, Iran, it had a monarchy. It was in many ways pretty Western. It was certainly actively involved in trade and had its own great culture. When that revolution happened and when the hardline Islamists took over, I have to say, I didn't know much about Islam at all in those days. I mean, I knew Cat Stevens was one, but I didn't know much about it. I certainly had never even heard of the concept of extreme radical Islam until 1979 and Iran. Well, here we are with 38 years on. There is a counter-revolution underway. How far it goes, I don't know. But I was looking, as I think all of us are, I was looking earlier on today to get just a little bit more knowledge about Iran and about what's going on. So I spoke to Michael Rubin, who is a former Pentagon official. He has lived in post-revolution Iran. He's advised senior military officials on the Middle East. He's currently a scholar at the public policy think tank, the American Enterprise Institute. And I began by asking him, what was Iran like before the 1979 revolution?
Well, Iran was a country on the move pre-1979. One of the problems was that it was perhaps developing too fast. So all these people from the villages came to the big cities. They wanted economic opportunities, but they never shed their village mentality, and that's what ultimately led to the Islamic Revolution. That said, this revolution, it was amazing. 10% of the population took part, and they were all united in what they were against, but they couldn't unite in what they were for. They were promised an Islamic democracy, and when I talked to people when I lived in Iran, they said, hey, look, I mean, we realized 6 months later that what we were getting was neither Islamic nor democracy, but by then it was too late, and ever since then, people have sort of been struggling and figuring out how to throw off this yoke of theocratic totalitarianism.
And we've seen, of course, over the course of the last week, a series of protests, over 20 people now killed. What do you see as the key reason for this wave of protests?
Well, it's a spark. I mean, the spark has been the economy in this case, perhaps unfulfilled expectations. But the thing to keep in mind is that over the last 20 years or so, there's been a series of protests. In 1999, it was a protest over closing a newspaper. In 2001, it was a protest over losing to Bahrain 3-1 in a World Cup qualifier. And then the rumor spread that the government had ordered the team to throw the match in order not to have men and women dancing in the street. And, of course, everyone remembers 2009. What's really clear at this point is Iran is a tinderbox, and the question is whether the governments that are smothering the embers, then the people are fanning the flames. But at this point, you know, when I talk to Iranians, they say ordinary middle-class Iranians, they can only eat meat, for example, about once a month because things are just getting priced out of reach. Meanwhile, they see all these ayatollahs who are fat and happy and literally have billions of dollars in the bank, and people said enough is enough.
Have the sanctions that have been put on Iran has an effect? I mean, is that what's leading to inflation on this scale?
Well, no. The thing to understand about Iran is while the sanctions have some effect, really it's the economic mismanagement of the mullahs which has had the most effect. What people should do is compare Iran, which is sitting on a sea of gas and oil, it's with 80 or 90 million people. Compare that to Turkey, which has no gas or oil, but a similar population, and you look at the trajectory of their economies, that just shows you over the past 30 years or so, even though I'm no friend of Turkey, about what management means when developing an economy. And simply put, studying in an Islamic seminary isn't the way to learn about the economy.
And how much power? I mean, Iran has a supreme leader in the shape of Ayatollah al-Khamenei and a president in Hassan Rouhani. How about, I mean, are these guys impregnable, or do you actually think there's a possibility that if these protests start to grow, that the regime could fall?
Well, the question is, first of all, the supreme leader considers himself theologically the deputy of the Messiah on earth. The problem is he's had cancer, and he's been public about it. I mean, pictures have been broadcast of him receiving cancer treatments, so people know that, look, his time on earth isn't infinite. At the same time, however, the key question is the security forces. You know, when people talk about Iran, they always talk about hardliners versus reformers in the political sphere. But 38 years after the Islamic Revolution, we really have no idea about the factional divisions within the Revolutionary Guard, within the besieged paramilitary, and that's what's playing out right now, whether people decide it's more important to stay true to ideology and fire on their friends, their classmates, their peers, or whether they're going to join the protests. And we've seen some reports that this is turning into like Romania in 1989, where the security forces join in.
Yeah, and I mean, of course, in the past, this regime has cracked down very heavily on dissidents, on protesters. I mean, is there a prospect that some of these people might get executed? I mean, I'm told 500 have been put in prison already.
Well, first of all, you can't trust the Iranian government numbers. If they say 500, they could just as easily mean 5,000. But yes, things are going to go very badly. Now, I was in Iran during the 99 student protests, and at that point, they basically smashed heads, and that led to the expansion of the protests. What the Iranians did was bring the Chinese in to get them up to speed on facial recognition software. So now what I suspect they're going to be doing is going in 3 weeks from now, taking pictures and then rounding people up in the middle of the night. We're going to see a massive crackdown if this doesn't work.
And interestingly, the Obama administration, the European Union, and successive British governments have done all they can to be friendly with this Iranian regime, you know, up to and including the deal that Obama did. I mean, have the West just totally got this wrong over the last few years?
Well, absolutely. And not only did we get it wrong, we got it wrong repeatedly. Between 1998 and 2005, European Union trade with Iran almost tripled. The price of gasoline quintupled. 70% of that hard currency windfall was invested in Iran's nuclear program and its ballistic missile program. The man who was the National Security Council in Iran at the time doing the investing was a so-called moderate named Hassan Rouhani. I mean, why we expect to shower them with cash and then have that lead to reform when so often it hasn't happened is beyond me.
Yes. Now, but interestingly, I mean, because every instinct in me, you know, when I see all these reports, Michael, I think, go on, you know, I'm willing people on who want democracy, who want equal rights, who want to live, you know, in a proper, decent society. But it's interesting because in the past you've written that Iranians dislike their government, but they dislike foreign invaders even more. So is it helpful for Donald Trump to say it's time for regime change? Is it helpful for Western figures to be encouraging these protests?
Well, what we should be doing is standing up on principles. We should be encouraging the right of people to have free speech, to have freedom of worship, and so forth. We shouldn't necessarily be picking favorites and saying, this is our guy on the ground. But ultimately, we can stand for principle and the principles which the Iranians so desperately want. The thing that makes Iran different than all the Arab states in the Arab Spring is Iran actually does have a very abbreviated history of democracy more than 100 years ago when they had a constitutional revolution. And that means some of this notion of democracy isn't going to be seen as a foreign implant. It's going to be seen as indigenous.
Yes. No, well, Michael, listen, thank you for giving us a background on Iran. I'm sure there are going to be some major events there over the course of the next few weeks, and we'd love you to come back on and keep us up to speed. And Michael Rubin, thank you for joining me this evening.
Thank you, Nigel.
Well, that was very interesting, wasn't it? Talk there about the fact that actually this protest, in the view of an Iranian expert in the shape of Michael Rubin, this protest could grow. We could be witnessing something very, very major, but not, I suspect, without a lot of people losing their lives and their liberty. So is it time for regime change in Iran? Well, look, the history of the regime changes that we push for in Iraq and in Libya have been disastrous, because we've actually got rid of secular dictators and opened the door, in many ways, for ISIS and other organisations. But in this case, I genuinely think regime change is absolutely the right thing. This is a bad regime. It doesn't just treat its people badly, it's doing all it can to acquire nuclear weapons. It is a very dangerous country indeed. And I meant what I said in that interview just now. You know, my feelings are very much with the people. And interestingly, over the course of the last half an hour, the US ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, has spoken out on this subject.
It takes great bravery for the Iranian people to use the power of their voice against their government, especially when their government has a long history of murdering its own people who dare to speak the truth. So we applaud the tremendous courage of the Iranian people.
Well, I'm absolutely with Nikki Haley on that. I applaud their courage. It takes some real guts to go out and do what these protesters are doing. And as I say, they're not just complaining about lack of jobs, about high prices. They're actually, in many cases, calling for the return of the monarchy. Seems unbelievable, but it is really, really happening. I have to say that our government have just got this wrong again and again and again. I mean, as recently as October, Prime Minister Theresa May had urged the US to recertify the nuclear deal with Iran because she said it is vitally important for regional security. And the European Union take the same view. We have been cozying up to this regime in Iran, despite their behaviour. We've got it completely wrong. I believe it's time for regime change. But what do you think? Call me on 0345 6060 973. Tell me what you think. I'm particularly keen to hear from Iranians living here in London or elsewhere, how they feel about these protests. Equally, let us know what you think by tweeting on 84850. You can, of course, tweet using the hashtag Farage and LBC at LBC. And, of course, you can watch us on Facebook. Comment there too from here in the London studio. So as 20 protesters are killed and at least 500 are put in prison, what has the reaction been of our global leaders to this counter-revolution that is now taking place in Iran? Well, I mentioned a moment ago that Theresa May slapped down Donald Trump as recently as October because he would not recertify the Iran nuclear deal. Although, having said that, Boris Johnson has said, that actually there are genuinely legitimate concerns that are being raised by the protesters and that they are asking the government in Tehran to take account of it. So perhaps a slight change of tone there. Out of the European Union, we've not had very much. Donald Trump has been tweeting. Well, there's a surprise. The people of Iran are finally acting against the brutal and corrupt Iranian regime. All of the money that President Obama so foolishly gave them went into terrorism and into their pockets. The people have little food, big inflation, and no human rights. The US is watching. And later on in the day, Trump finished a tweet by saying, time for change. So the American president is now pretty openly calling for regime change. That does raise questions as to whether outside voices from the West are actually helpful or not. But there's one person who hasn't said a dicky bird. His name is Jeremy Corbyn, the 68-year-old, cuddly, lovely, fluffy leader of the Labour Party. And he has said nothing about this. Why? Well, because he himself has really been rather close to this Iranian regime. He, through Press TV, which was an Iranian state-funded broadcast network, he, between 2009 and 2012, earned £20,000 in fees from them. But far more seriously than that, he's appeared repeatedly on a number of platforms with what I would call pretty undesirable pro-Iranian regime types. For example, in February 2014, he spoke at a seminar in London held by the Islamic Centre of England celebrating the 35th anniversary of the Islamic Revolution in Iran. And his speech was entitled, The Case for Iran. So, when you believe that Jeremy Corbyn is what we need for gay rights, for women rights, for giving us and making a fairer, better society, and by the way, when he puts those arguments across, he looks very convincing. I'm sorry, but his record of standing up and defending this hardline Islamist regime is completely contrary to all of that. I believe it is time for regime change, but But let's ask people who know far more than I do. We're going, believe it or not, our first caller is calling from Tehran, the capital of Iran. It's Layla. She's a first-time caller. Good evening.
Hi.
Hello there. So, is it time for regime change? Are these protests big enough to perhaps make that happen?
Actually, I don't think so. If it meant to happen, it would happen the last time. I think it was about 8 years ago.
2009,
because
yes.
It was much more bigger. It was huge back then. And all of us thought that this is going to happen, but it didn't happen, actually. And this time, it's not that big. And you might not believe it, but not all the people want the regime to be changed. Not all of them. Maybe even more than 50% of the people are okay with the politicians over here, with most of the things. Maybe they are fed up with economics, the culture, I don't know, the problems over here. But it's not like what everyone is talking about. And it's maybe Trump is saying that he is with people of Iran, but honestly, up to 99% of Iranian people hate him.
Now, Leda, I completely understand that, and I do think there is perhaps a situation here where if the West was seen to interfere, and certainly if it was interfering, backing those fighting against the government, I agree with you, that could well backfire. But, when we look at the way your country is being run, I mean, the economy is in a disastrous condition, isn't it?
Yeah, but... you might not believe it, but I've been listening to LBC for like about 1 or 2 years every day at work when I'm studying. But most of the problems we have here, even I can hear that you have them in England too. I know that we have many problems. I'm not saying that we are happy. No, we are not. I myself am miserable in many ways in this country. But some of the problems are in all the countries.
But, however bad our government is, and goodness me, I've criticised them a bit over the course of the last year and more, but, they don't actually execute and murder people, including children, do they? And they're the kind of things that are happening in Iran, let alone rights for women or for gay people. I mean, frankly, Layla, there's no comparison, really, is there?
Yeah, if you want to compare, there are many countries that you can't not compare to England. But all I'm saying is that, there are problems. I'm an atheist, and you might not believe that I cannot say that even to my family because my family is so religious. So for me, living in Iran I don't like it, actually.
Right, okay.
But all I'm saying is that people... really, they don't know what they want. Some of them say that, okay, we like the politicians, we don't like this. In my family, we are 5. My father fought in the war, and he is so religious, and he says, okay, I love Khamenei. Mm-hmm. And even in our own family, we are so diverse, and anyone wants something else. That's also the case between the people. And
I'm sure Leda, I'm sure that's right. And yes, anyone that tries to portray the protesters as representing virtually everybody in Iran clearly isn't going to be right about that. And I understand that. And I hope your life becomes a bit more cheerful in Iran. But Layla, finally, your analysis is that the 2009 protests were much, much bigger than this. So do you see this current wave just fizzling out in your view?
No, I don't think so.
You don't think so?
Seriously, no one thinks that.
Right. So it's going to continue for a long time?
No.
No?
Because, for example, today, when I was coming back from work, and the things mostly start, the people come out after dark when they are finished with work. And today it was so quiet. There were many police officers and stuff like that, but I don't think something really big is going to happen. OK,
Layla, thank you very much indeed for your call. Well, Layla there making a very interesting point, because in 2009 there were some really very big protests against the government. In fact, there have been a series of protests repeatedly over the course of the 38 years of this hardline Islamic rule. Lots and lots of messages coming in from you. Ian Dennis says, those of us who have been around for a while were horrified by Obama's strategy of engaging with the Iranian theocratic government. Obama showing a green light to develop their nuclear capability was at best naive and at worst planet-alteringly dangerous. We now have Trump in power. There's at least a chance that the ordinary people can regain control of the situation. Well, Ian, I agree with that, but I just wonder, Trump may say things, but if America was seen to intervene in any way by perhaps providing support or arms for the rebels, I wonder whether the loathing of America in that country would mean that it could just backfire. No, I get. Hasn't the West had enough of encouraging revolt, as in the Arab Spring, and then leaving people high and dry? Why do we interfere in a sovereign country's affairs? Well, generally, I agree with you. I was completely opposed to the Iraq war. I could not see just removing Saddam Hussein for the sake of it would make things better, and it didn't. I was livid about Libya. I couldn't believe what we were doing. I mean, now they have open slave markets in Libya. That's what we achieved by getting rid of, however much we may not have liked him. But actually, Gaddafi was not a religious hardliner. But I feel differently about this. I feel that if in some way the people were able to topple this theocratic, really deeply unpleasant, hardline Islamist regime, I think the world would be a better and a safer place. I wonder what Faza thinks, who's calling from Wapping. Good evening.
Good evening to you, Nigel.
Good. Now, are you Iranian, Faza?
Yes, I am.
Right.
And I have been living in exile since 1982 in different countries in Europe. Now I settle in UK. And what I would like to add, I have been listening to this program and before Ian as well, people calling and just coming with a different argument. What I really, and our cause does really do not need, is the support from Trump or Netanyahu. Let us deal with it.
Yeah.
Because the difference, if I may add, the difference between 2009 demonstration and now it is, in 2009, it was all the major cities. Now, small cities all over the country, which is over 50 cities at the same time. In one city, southern part of the country, people have taken over the city. They have thrown all the Revolutionary Guard and the military and the police officers out of the city, one by one. And what it is, now we are one step ahead what we were in 2009. We start pointing and aiming against the Ayatollahs, not just the reform. Now reform is passed. We want the regime change, supporting from Trump and Netanyahu, so government and the Khamenei label us as the hands and the puppet of the Israeli or the Americans. We don't want that.
No, I understand that, Faza. And so your point's very interesting. You think this revolt is far more widespread, perhaps, than my previous caller did. Would you, let me ask you, if your country went back to being what it was in the 1970s, would you like to go back there?
I will definitely go. Back in 90s, if I knew it's going to be like that, I would have fought against all the Islamic and the revolution. I would have done it with the weapon and the gun.
Yeah. Well, Faza, listen, I've met lots of Iranians like you, people who are heartbroken that they can't live in the country of their birth, where their culture is from. They'd love to go back if it became a proper free country. I thank you for your call. I would love to see the back of this hardline Islamist regime in Iran. I think they've made the world a much more dangerous place. There are many that warn me that, of course, if we do that, that'll lead to great instability and could have consequences for other countries, Iran being the leading part of the Shia religion in terms of size and power. But just a quick thought, as it's New Year, about what happened in London on New Year's Eve. There were 5 separate knife attacks that took place in the capital that night, resulting in the deaths of 4 young people. That's 80 people that died through knife crime in London in 2017 alone. It is a rise of 31% year on year from the previous figures. And it isn't just knife crime. All other forms of violent crime are rising very rapidly in London indeed. And I think that when Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London, talks about these things, he tends to talk in platitudes. I would advise a bit less attacking Donald Trump and other world leaders you don't like, and we need some real tough community action. I'm not saying we can solve knife crime, but I think generally the feeling is we're not, frankly, doing quite enough to stop it. Back to Iran, back to regime change, and back to Jeremy Corbyn not having said a dicky bird about this, because I suggest he's too close to this regime. He's openly supported it many times over the years, which is entirely in total contradiction to everything he says he stands for in domestic policy. Jody says to me on Facebook, Jeremy keeps all channels open because that's how you move forward. That's fine, Jody, but you don't need to appear on a platform celebrating the 35th anniversary of the Islamic Revolution in Iran, do you? Andrew says, even if Iran does have enormous oil reserves, the UK should not get involved in any regime change in Iran. Andrew, I agree with you. We shouldn't get involved, but I do wish the protesters well. My heart is with them. Steve says, Iranians have already said the factory workers haven't been paid in about 8 months, and teachers are not being paid for the last 2 months. And of course they're going to go mad. We would do here and in France as well. Yes, economics, Steve, is a big part of this, but hey, there's something much bigger and more fundamental. When you've got crowds chanting for the return of the Shah, something remarkable is beginning to happen. I've got Halim on the line, a first-time caller from Bath. Good evening.
Hello, good evening. I just want to say about people in Iran, the lady who called, and her name was Leila, and saying that more than 90% don't want regime change. That's a lie. Everybody, I'm sure it's exactly opposite. More than 90% of Iranian people, both inside Iran and outside Iran, want regime to change. People don't want this regime all from beginning. That's a stolen revolution, really. I was only 9 when revolution happened, and we all asked our parents, and I know the new generation asked their parents why this happened. Even our parents don't know exactly what's happened, because that was a stolen revolution. And nobody wants this to happen, really. And about what you said, that you shouldn't really be involved in this, I think both England and the States or any Western countries should be involved as much as they've been involved when the Shah went, and they really helped that this happened in that time. We Iranian people, both inside and outside, we really suffer. We want a regime change. We want Iran to be how it was before 1979.
Well, I sense, Salim, I sense that you're right. I was a little bit surprised by some of the things that Layla said earlier. I mean, she was basically saying, look, we may have a few problems in Iran, but look at your own country. Well, there's no comparison, is there, between the way the British government treats its own people and the way the Iranian regime treats its own people. How long have you been living outside Iran?
Well, I left Iran in 1988 when I was 18, and that was really a hard time. I really wanted to live in Iran. This is my wish, to live in Iran.
Yeah.
But in the situation that we have at the moment, it's difficult to live in Iran for us. And I know lots of people like to leave because they can't really tolerate the situation. They have no freedom. That's not how people like to live. Islam has been forced to people, and even those who've been really religious, they don't like to be religious anymore. They just hate the situation.
How tough is it?
I tell you who this Layla type is. These are people who have been paid by regime, people who have...
Well, we don't know that. We don't know that, whether Layla is paid by the regime or not. We don't know that. She had an opinion, and it's an open debate. Tell me just one quick question. How easy is it for people currently living in Iran, how easy is it for them to leave the country?
To leave the country? Well, lots of people love to leave the country, but it's not easy because of course, all other countries, they can't really give visa for all these people to come and live in their country. And you know how it's the problem with foreigner living in England or who wants to come from other countries is not always easy. And also, I left Iran even when I was very young, but still I really struggle because I think anyone can have much better time in their own country. It's difficult to be totally 100% acceptable in a new culture. Even if I'm obviously I'm all right. My family are okay. We have a good life here, but still we have lots of English friends, lots of Iranian friends. But still, I think for anyone, it's always nice to could live in their own country.
Are you hopeful? I mean, do you believe that the moment has come where realistically the regime could fall?
Well, it can, because obviously it's very strange if it doesn't, because over 90% of people want that.
Okay, well, no. I don't know that number. I don't know whether you're right about that. Certainly, 90% of the Iranians plus that I've spoken to and met over the last 30 years in London feel that way. I can't comment on it. But listen, Halim, thank you very much for your comments. I thought somehow that the words from Layla would get some kickback. Patrick says, regime change worked really well, didn't it? In Afghanistan, Iraq and Syria, what could possibly go wrong? Iman is calling from Neasden, a first-time caller. Good evening.
Good evening, Nigel.
Good evening. So, how do you read it?
So, basically, I have a lot to say, but first thing I'm going to do is apologise to you, Nigel, and to Halim, and tell you that your hopes, they're meaningless, because I don't think these protests will, continue. I think they're going to die out, and they're going to die out quite soon.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the reason why they will is because, well, the moment I knew this, it was the moment when I heard slogans, for bringing back the Shah.
Yeah.
And I think there are a lot of economic problems. I think corruption's a big problem in Iran, as it is in many countries, and it is really unfortunate, especially in the banking industry and the oil industry. But I've volunteered in a number of charities and independent charities, separate from the government, and I've spoken to a lot of the poorest people. And in the town of Mashhad, where the protests actually started, in northeastern Iran, and the poorest there, and I've spoken to so many. I know this won't represent everyone, but I've spoken to hundreds of them, and from what I gather, I think people they don't really have a problem with the regime. They don't really care. People don't care. Same way here, people in Britain, a lot of people are Republican. They don't care. They don't want to kill themselves trying to get rid of the monarchy. I think what they care about is the economy.
But Iman, the monarchy, whether you like it or not, and by the way, most people in this country really do like it, but the monarchy does not directly affect your life. If you live in Iran today, you have rampant inflation, estimates of unemployment that are, in some parts of the country, as high as 60%, certainly over half the young people in the country without jobs, and without the ability, Iman, to speak freely and to live the way most of us in the West do.
I agree with you. I agree. These are big problems, massive problems, but the thing is, it's not really the regime's fault. It's I think
really.
I think let me finish. I think as an Iranian, as someone who's been raised in Britain but who is Iranian, I think there's a massive cultural problem to do with corruption and to do with the fact that people want the best for themselves, and we can see that from Babak Zanjani, who was the person that was arrested a few years ago and still being punished, and he was extradited from the West as well, and they agree with that. This kind of corruption is rampant. That's a big problem.
So, Iman, there is a case for reform here, isn't there? Yeah, and you and I would both agree that there are a lot of things the regime is doing very badly. It should be reformed and changed. Let me ask you, how can it be reformed and changed unless it is through huge protests?
I think you have to be honest, I don't know the solution. Neither do you. No one does. I think time will tell how it can be solved, but I do not believe that these protests will. No. You've
made your point. You think this will fizzle out, and you're the second caller, because we had Layla earlier saying to us that actually in Tehran it felt much bigger in 2009 than it feels there today. Iman, I thank you very much indeed for your call and for your point of view. Is it time for regime change in Iran? I think it is, but I do understand it could lead to all sorts of consequences, perhaps even bigger migratory flows coming to Europe. So there's nothing here that's easy or straightforward. But it is, I think, and we spoke earlier to Michael Rubin, a former Pentagon official, and he was making the point that actually what we need to do here is to stand up for principle, and the principle that people should be free and able to speak their minds and live their lives is, I think, the most fundamental point. Some great comments coming in. Lovely one here on Twitter. Gosh, I've got some fans out there. Nigel, you are a warmonger. Do you know, I've been called so many things over the years. I don't think I've ever been called a warmonger. So thank you, whoever you are. Illegal warmongering missions have no right. We should not be policing the world. I'm not arguing, whoever you are, anonymous, please put your name on next time. I'm not arguing that we should militarily involve ourselves. I think, in many ways, that could actually do harm to those that are out there protesting. And nor do I think the Americans should either. It is up to the people in Iran to sort this out. But, I repeat the point, my heart is with them. All the other attempts at regime change have been a disaster. Getting rid of the secular Arab dictators has made those countries worse, not better. But this is something that is fundamentally different. Ian says, if Obama had said the US was keeping an eye on what was going on in Iran, everyone would have said he was encouraging restraint. Trump says it, and everyone says he's stirring up dissent. Well, that was the original Trump position. The original Trump position was, we're watching it. But I think, as I explained to you earlier, Trump has now gone much, much further today and is now basically calling for regime change. Vala says to me on Twitter, Iran does have many issues regarding civil rights and human rights. However, the downfall of the regime would just make the situation worse and open the door for ISIS and other terrorist organisations. Well, I can't say that's wrong, because if there is a vacuum, no one knows what is going to happen. But I just think that what happened back in 1979 began the rise of radical Islamist extremism and was a bad thing. And if it could be reversed, I think overall that'd be a good thing. But I do accept it wouldn't come without risks. I wonder what Mike from Hemel Hempstead thinks. Good evening.
Good evening, Nigel. Happy New Year to yourself.
Happy New Year to you. So what do you think, Mike? Is it time for regime change? Or would...
It's time for regime change, but the West must not have anything whatsoever to do with it.
Yep. Well, I'm with you on that.
Because, as a previous caller said, we've tried this in Afghanistan, Iraq and Libya, and it's all gone pear-shaped. There's one major difference with Iran. They have a nuclear arsenal. Now, if one of their nutcases got hold of one of those, we'd all be in Queer Street. However, on the plus side, if there was regime change in Iran, then the likes of Hezbollah and Hamas would directly lose their support, which could be a major game changer in, say, Palestine and Israel. It'd do them a lot of favours.
Yeah, I mean, they are developing their nuclear capability. That is absolutely right. Is Iran a big threat to us right at this moment in time? Well, I think increasingly it probably is. But, Mike, I'm with you. We mustn't get involved. We mustn't intervene. I'm 100% with Mike from Hemel Hempstead on that point. Time for regime change, for sure. Obama's policies have backfired. Pandering is over. The regime is awful, I get on Twitter. And I've got Mehdi on the line from Barnet, a first-time caller. Good evening.
A very good evening to Nigel. First time I'm talking to you.
Very good. Well, welcome. So tell me, what is your interest in Iran?
Oh, I am an Iranian.
Yep.
And unfortunately, I have been in this country for 38 years, since the revolution.
Oh, wow.
Well, the most beautiful country that I have known. I have travelled many, many places. But the theocratic regime, since 1979, not only interfered in the lives of people around the world, it has killed and executed its own people time and time and time again. They have spent millions and billions of dollars, all the oil money, on Palestinians. They've rebuilt Lebanon. They have rebuilt Iraq. and they are just about to rebuild Syria. They cannot possibly help their own people when there is an earthquake. They are incapable of looking inwards. And that's why these people are fed up with them. Now, many people in Iran do chant for His Majesty Reza Pahlavi. He is the only obvious choice. I totally agree with you. The only...
Tell me, what age were you when you came to the UK?
I was 19.
You were 19, yeah.
Correct.
Yeah. So you remember Iran being a great place to live?
Absolutely. Would I, or would many people like me, like to go back? Should it go back to 1979, I would go tomorrow morning.
Do you know, I think that's right. And do you know something? Through my life in business, and everything from businessmen to people driving taxis in Washington, D.C., I've met lots of Iranians, you know, who are of a certain age, who remember the country as it was back in the 1970s. Have to say, I've generally found them to be some of the most educated, polite and charming people I've met from any country in the world. And I think you're right. I think there are lots of you that would love to go back to Iran. Do you, just finally, Mehdi, do you believe in your heart that this particular uprising has any chance of success?
That remains to be seen. But what we need to take note of in the Western world is that stop appeasing the Ayatollahs. Stop dancing around because of one reason or another. Let the people of Iran make their choice, and the choice is Reza Pahlavi.
So do you think that the European Union, the British government and the Obama administration got Iran completely wrong?
You said it, Jeremy. People like Jeremy Corbyn dance around this regime, take their money for their own gain. Also, when we have Mr. Johnson going down for a British Iranian, we do talk, but it ends there. We need to stop appeasing them. And allow...
No, you've made that point beautifully, Mehdi. I thank you very much for that call and for that passion. And if you're listening, Jeremy Corbyn, we're all ears. We want to hear that you've changed your mind, that you are now going to condemn this awful, barbaric regime. People would love to hear that. And my final caller on tonight's show is Sina, who's calling from Woking. Good evening.
Good evening, Nigel. It's a pleasure talking to you, though I'm not a huge fan of your policy. Well,
that's okay. That's not, you know, we don't encourage people to ring in because they support the things I stand for. This is about, it's about open, democratic debate. In fact, it's about the very thing that people in Iran are not... LBC would not be able to exist in Iran today, and that's the point, isn't it?
Absolutely, yes, correct. So, yes, my opinion is that, yes, it's absolutely the right time for a regime change in Iran. This is a lot different this time. This time, it's not about a dispute between the supporters of two different parties within the cleric regime. It is the mullahs and the rule of mullahs that are in people's, in demonstrators' crosshairs. They are now targeting the Khamenei, the very core of the whole Islamic Republic. People are chanting, no more Islamic Republic, just Iranian Republic. And there are a lot of people who are chanting for Reza Pahlavi. And, well, there are many, many people that are regretting their...
So you're cheering them on from Woking, are you?
Yes, definitely.
Well,
I do really believe that if we regret what happened back in 1979, then Reza Pahlavi is the rightful heir.
Okay. Sina, I thank you very much for your call. I thank you for all the calls. A large number of Iranians living in London and one also in Tehran on the show this evening. This story is going to run and run. You've been listening to the Nigel Farage Show.